I'm Nigel Morris-Cotterill, and this is Financial Crime Basics from FinCrimeTV. In this episode, what is predicate crime? Money or other benefits can only be laundered if it is the proceeds of criminal conduct. Later in this episode, we will look at a very contentious point. Do prosecutors have to prove that a crime was in fact committed, and if so, do they have to prove that the monies arose from that specific crime? We will also look at what crimes are considered to be predicate crime. This too is quite contentious. And finally, we will look at commonality of offence. But first, let's look at the term itself. The verb to predicate means to base or found. So to predicate upon means to base or found an argument upon. For example, a research paper will be predicated upon certain facts, or what are said to be facts. By extension, the term to predicate was applied in the early days of counter-money laundering laws to the conduct which resulted in the proceeds of criminal conduct. A person who trades in illegal drugs obtains proceeds of that illegal trade. When he or anyone else deals with those proceeds, the drugs trade is the predicate crime. Another way of thinking about it is that it's the origin of criminally derived funds. This is why it's so important that we know our customers, not simply what passes through their bank or other accounts. People commit crime, money doesn't. So to concentrate almost exclusively upon a person's known financial dealings will rarely provide an indication of a predicate crime unless it is a pure financial crime where all the evidence is in documentary form, such as tax evasion. That brings us to the contentious point I mentioned earlier. You'll have to find out for yourself what the position is in your own country or even state, because some states have their own counter-money laundering laws in addition to national or federal law. The reason you'll have to find out for yourself is because there are many different approaches, and even where legislation provides for such activity, some courts have made decisions that are completely contrary to the statute. The various alternatives are, for a person to be convicted of money laundering, the actual benefit found in the hands of the accused must be traced to an actual crime. Alternatively, for a person to be convicted of money laundering, the accused must have been convicted of an actual crime that results in benefits. Third, for a person to be convicted of money laundering, it is sufficient for the prosecutor to show that a crime was committed and that there is a reasonable chain connecting the money to the accused. It's important to note that this relates to convictions. The position relating to the confiscation of assets is often different to the position relating to conviction. Now finally, let's look at what offences are to be considered predicate crimes. There are three schools of thought. Well, actually there are two, but many countries have made a mess of their law and have started with one approach and then seemingly as an afterthought overlaid the second one on the first. I'll explain. The confusion all started in the late 1980s. There was a determination to try to stop the international drugs trade, and at one time it was said that the third largest commercial activity after oil and weapons was drugs. The Bank for International Settlements is the Central Bankers Club, and at that time central banks regulated banks. The bank produced a very clear document that said its members would require the banks they regulated to put in place measures to prevent themselves being used to launder the proceeds of drugs trafficking. The G7, a group within the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, decided to create a supposedly independent body. This was to expand on the Bank for International Settlements, simple approach. That body was the Financial Action Task Force, or FATF. The FATF produced a list of what is called recommendations that it required its members to follow. This is not the place to go into the many and varied wider issues relating to the FATF. I'm making a very narrow point. And here's where it gets messy. The FATF actually recommended that countries should not have a list of offences at all, but if it did, then a small number of specific offences were the absolute minimum that should be included. the FATF strongly recommended that countries should adopt what became known as all crimes legislation. As is usual with buzzwords, it doesn't mean what it says. It doesn't mean, for example, that every single offence on the statute book should be considered as having the potential to be a predicate crime. What it actually meant was that any offence for which an accused person could be sentenced to jail for 1 year or more should be regarded as a predicate crime. The USA and Australia were prime proponents of the list-based approach. The EU, which has a far greater reach through the various dominions and former dominions of its member states, insisted on an all-crimes approach. The USA and Australia's outreach schemes resulted in a lists-based approach in many developing countries, especially in Southeast Asia. But countries soon noticed the flaws in that system, and this is where the not really a third approach came in. To satisfy the demands of Australia and the USA, which were pumping money into countries to get them to adopt laws they wanted to see, the lists approach appeared in the legislation. But then switched-on countries tagged on an all-crimes provision, which from a pure law legal perspective rendered the lists OTOs. But sadly, not a lot of people noticed, and still tried to follow the list-based approach, and today that is still happening. Some countries have several hundred offences, some surprisingly specific in their lists, leaving staff in financial institutions in an impossible position. Even specialists do not and cannot remember the full lists and have to look them up. And there's one last point. Criminal conduct committed in one country can be considered a predicate offence for money laundering in another country, provided that the conduct would be a crime in both countries. This is called commonality of offence. The USA and Switzerland were in serious dispute for years because the USA has a crime of tax evasion. Switzerland does not. Switzerland prosecutes the offence of making a false declaration. The USA insisted that the Swiss change their law. Switzerland pointed out that uttering, this is a legal term meaning producing, a false document and submitting it to a federal authority is an offence in US law. And so there was already commonality of offence. It just didn't fit the USA's public relations message to use it. What looked like a simple question has turned out to be both complicated and contentious, hasn't it? Thank you for watching. Don't forget to follow, like, share and of course keep watching FinCrimeTV. I'll see you next time.